Hello, I'm Pastor Elaine from Advent Lutheran Church in Toronto. Like many of you, I've been interested in C.S. Lewis for years and a fan of the Narnia Chronicles since childhood. I discovered Lewis's other writings as a university student, The Four Loves in a Philosophy course as an undergraduate. I came up against some of the theological writing and a grief observed while studying divinity. I found Perelandra from a Space Trilogy at a book sale while on vacation, and the Screwtape Letters were a happy accident. But I returned time and again to Narnia, a place I dearly wished to visit as a child. Like Lucy, I love the chance to slip away from the world I mostly inhabit. The question of whether this is the real world is one best left to philosophers. And escape to a land where magic rules, the unbelievable or inconceivable are the norm, and where there's excitement and adventure. Lucy did it by entering the wardrobe in a professor's home outside of London during the Blitz. We can do it through books and music and movies, and of course, a healthy dose of imagination. Over the next couple of weeks, I hope to take us deeper into Narnia as we examine some significant themes woven into the adventure story. We'll begin by setting the stage, learning a little bit about C.S. Lewis, his role as an academic and Christian apologeticist, defending his faith, his relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien and his writing. Then we will look at the lion, Aslan's role and identity, the witch, her background and myths surrounding her heritage, and of course the great showdown between good and evil. The next session will be devoted to the role of the children, Edmund's betrayal, and the question of discipleship. We'll once again visit Tolkien and Lewis and consider ideas of imagination and myth and faith and magic. C.S. Lewis was born in November of 1898 in Belfast, Northern Ireland. His older brother Warren was 3. Two major childhood events would shape Lewis and the man he became. First, his mother died in 1908, leaving a gap that perhaps was never filled. His father was unable to cope emotionally with his own loss, and subsequently could not help his sons. Lewis became very dependent on his relationship with his older brother, Warnie. In 1910, Lewis suffered from severe respiratory difficulties. This illness changed the direction of his education and left a permanent mark on his personality. The active child became much more passive, living more comfortably in the world of books and imagination. Lewis identified this as a terribly lonely period, and combined with the death of his mother, led him to reject the faith of his childhood and his parents, Christianity. Lewis's experiences at boarding school would also shape his adulthood. He found it both sadistic and miserable. The headmaster from one school had been convicted of cruelty to his students before Lewis had arrived, and a few years later was certified as insane. Further details of his schooling come from an article in the New Yorker magazine from November of 2005. This loving and mother-deprived boy was sent to a series of nightmarish English boarding schools, where he was beaten and bullied and traumatized beyond even the normal expectations of English adolescence. Lewis's own words about the place are practically Leninist. One headmaster raced down the length of a room with his cane to beat a lower middle-class boy, enraged by his social pretensions. Lewis writes about his last school, Malvern, at such length and with such horror, with far more intensity than he writes about even serving on the Western Front. In Lewis's letters to children, he mentions his boarding school experiences on several occasions, but declines to discuss them, only to say that they were worse than his experience of trench warfare. And those experiences led to nightmares for the rest of his life. A.N. Wilson spends some time in his biography talking about the effect of the schools on a young man in a time of sexual awakening, and claims that they resulted in mildly sadomasochistic fantasies, like spanking. Alan Jacobs agrees with this view. It was the outbreak of World War I that would wrench Lewis from the cozy path of scholar in training and shadow his visions of good and evil and pain and suffering. Lewis's war experiences would appear, often thinly disguised in his writings. Lewis reached the front line in the Somme Valley, France, on his 19th birthday. The following year, he was wounded, recovered, and sent back to battle. He was discharged in December 1919. With the end of the war, Lewis returned to Oxford, where he excelled in Greek, Latin, philosophy, ancient history, and English. In 1925, Lewis became a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, where he taught English language and literature for 29 years. Oxford gave Lewis the companionship and security that was taken from his home life and further damaged by the war. On a personal level, Lewis moved in with his brother and the mother of a friend. This domestic relationship would last for years. It is this relationship that is one of the central mysteries of Lewis's life. Before leaving for France, Lewis and his friend Patrick Moore had promised each other that if one was killed in action, the other would look after their parents. Moore was killed, and Lewis kept his promise for 32 years. Lewis spent a great deal of time with Janie Moore, including extended holidays. He refused to discuss the relationship with his friends and tried to keep it as quiet as possible. Both Lewis biographers Wilson and Jacobs believe that the relationship was sexual. As Moore grew older and her health failed, the pressures on Lewis increased. His brother Warnie, who shared the house, spoke of it as self-imposed slavery. Lewis himself made mention of the difficulties in looking after a demanding invalid in his letters to children. Janie Moore's death in 1951 freed Lewis from his wartime promise. It was through fellowship with other scholars, a group that called themselves the Inklings, that Lewis would turn to Christianity. In 1929, he declared a belief in God. By 1931, he had become a Christian. Lewis addressed the issue of his conversion in Surprised by Joy, and it can be traced directly to his relationship with J.R.R. Tolkien, a devout Catholic. We return to a New Yorker article and Alan Jacobs for a detailed discussion of the conversion experience. It was through the intervention of the secretive and personally troubled Tolkien, however, that Lewis finally made the turn toward Orthodox Christianity. In company with another friend, they took a long and now famous walk on an autumn evening in 1931, pacing and arguing from early evening to early morning. Tolkien was a genuinely eccentric character. In college, the inventor of Lothlorien played the part of the humorless pedant who had been ready to convert Lewis for several years. Lewis was certainly ripe to be converted. The liberal humanism in which he had been raised as a thinker had come to seem far too narrowly Philistine and materialist to account for the intimations of transcendence that came to him on country walks and in pages of poetry. Tolkien, seizing on this vulnerability, said that the obvious, seeming distinction that Lewis made between myth and fact, between intimations of timeless joy and belief in a historically based religion, was a false one. Language and the consciousness it reflected was intrinsically magical. One had to become religious to save the magic, not to be saved from it. All existence, Tolkien insisted on that night ramble, was intrinsically mythical. The stars were the fires of the gods, if you chose to see them that way. Just as the world was the stories you made up from it. If you were drawn to myth at all, as Lewis was, then you ought to accept the Christian myth just as you accepted the lovely northern ones. By the end of the walk, Lewis was, or was about to become, a churchgoer. The Inklings met weekly for 16 years, Thursday evenings in Lewis's rooms and just before lunch on Fridays or Mondays in a local pub. Members of the group included Tolkien, Lewis's brother Warren, Hugh Dyson, Charles Williams, Dr. Robert Harvard, Owen Barfield, and others. The 1930s was a particularly creative time for Lewis, where he wrote and published several important academic tomes. But it was the 1940s where Lewis began to focus on his Christian writings. The first to be published were the Screwtape Letters in The Guardian. In the mid-40s, Lewis's role as a theologian and writer was formally acknowledged when he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Divinity by the University of St. Andrews. The honors continued. Lewis's Canadian connection was an honorary Doctor of Letters given by Laval University in 1952. It was during this period that a new element entered C.S. Lewis's life. He was contacted by a fan, an American divorcee, a Jew who converted to Christianity largely on the basis of Lewis's works. Joy Davidman Gresham would have an enormous impact on Lewis. She would become the key that would unlock his passions and his emotions. She rescued a lonely man and showed him how to live. Joy was bright, intellectual, the mother of 2 young sons, and an aspiring writer in her own right. She was also the secret message in the title of Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy. A doubly significant title, as he always referred to his experience of the divine as joy. In 1954, Lewis left the cozy confines of Oxford and moved to Cambridge, where he took up the post of Chair of Medieval and Renaissance Literature. In the same year, he published a review of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Apparently, discussion of Tolkien's work cropped up frequently at meetings of the Inklings, and Lewis has been quoted as saying he was tired of hearing about the damned hobbits. Tolkien was not much more complimentary about Lewis's talking animals. According to Lewis biographers, Tolkien hated the Narnia books, despite Lewis's avid sponsorship of Tolkien's own mythology, because he hated to see an imagination constrained by the allegorical impulse. Tolkien also thought Lewis had not developed his mythology deeply enough. He was just jotting things down. In April of 1956, Lewis married Joy Davidman in a civil bedside ceremony. A Church of England ceremony was performed 8 months later. Joy suffered from cancer, and her death seemed imminent. Joy's cancer went into remission, and she lived until 1960. Lewis's relationship with Joy Davidman was the material for the movie Shadowlands. Lewis came to love later in life, but lived his relationship with Davidman fully and passionately. Lewis described it as feasting on love and wrote that no cranny of heart or body remained unsatisfied. Lewis's grief at the death of Joy was recorded in his book, A Grief Observed. It is the diary of his encounter with a terrible loss and the process of grieving for his soulmate. Clive Staple Lewis, or Jack as he was familiarly called, died in 1963. Ralph Wood has written a fascinating article on the differences between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. They were friends and scholars and believers, but there were significant and important differences between the two men. Tolkien, a devout Catholic, had no use for the Church of England that Lewis attended. According to Wood, Lewis's ecumenicism extended ever so happily to his friendships. He was a practitioner of Christian companionship in ways unknown to Tolkien. Among Lewis's friends were the philosopher Owen Barfield, the Italian priest Dom Giovanni Calabria, and Lewis's homosexual childhood mate from the Plymouth Brethren, Arthur Greaves. Nor did Lewis ever relent his high estimate of Tolkien, even after Tolkien, resentful at Lewis's bringing Joy Davidman into the Inkling circle, virtually broke off their relationship. Tolkien, in turn, acknowledged that he would never have brought The Lord of the Rings to publication without the constant encouragement of Lewis. Tolkien was also one of the main advocates for Lewis's appointment to the chair of English for Magdalen College, Cambridge in 1954, after he had so long and so unjustly been denied a professorship at Oxford. Yet Tolkien neither called on Lewis during David Min's illness, nor did he attend her funeral when she died. Even so, Tolkien was devastated by Lewis's death in 1963. He declared that an axe blow had been struck at his roots. The unpayable debt that I owe to him was not influence, as it is ordinarily understood, but sheer encouragement. He was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. In the biographical background of Lewis, I alluded to several of his works, and now I'd like to flesh that out a little bit. Along with Lewis's scholarly work on literature and literary criticism, there's a broad offering of Christian writings. It is a matter of debate whether Lewis was best known during his lifetime as a scholar, a Christian apologeticist, or a writer of fantasy. Lewis wrote reflections on the Psalms, discussed humanity's distance from God in The Great Divorce, and addressed the age-old question of why do bad things happen in The Problem of Pain. Lewis's foray into the world of fantasy had begun as a young boy when he and his brother Warnie would create and inhabit make-believe worlds. Apparently, Jack preferred to pepper his lands with aspects of the natural world, especially talking animals. Lewis was a big fan of ancient Norse myths and Beatrix Potter. Lewis's best-known fantasy work, of course, is the 7-volume Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis also wrote another fantasy series, this one targeted specifically at adults, called A Space Trilogy. And many people thought that he used his fellow academics as models for the characters. I made reference earlier to Lewis's publication of the Screwtape Letters. This slim volume was first published as a series by a religious newspaper. The newspaper was called The Guardian and ceased publication in 1951 and had no relationship to the Manchester Guardian. The Screwtape Letters are funny and tragic, a commentary on good versus evil, a not unfamiliar theme in Lewis's writing. It is also a social commentary. The war figures prominently in the letters. It is a series of letters between a senior devil and a junior tempter. Bureaucracy is alive and well in hell. Lewis himself said that his favorite books were Perelandra from the Space Trilogy and Till We Have Faces. But he claimed that the Screwtape Letters were much more popular. He also said that he much preferred to write fiction than anything else. Lewis was a formidable correspondent. He wrote back to everyone who wrote to him, regardless of their age. His brother Warnie functioned as secretary and learned to type to assist in this job. Lewis wrote everything in longhand. Lewis kept up a correspondence for many years with several children, and these letters can be read in an edited form in the book Letters to Children. Lewis was always happy to get a positive response to his work and was full of encouragement for all those who wished to write. Now that we've had a brief introduction to C.S. Lewis's life, the influences that shaped his writing and his friendships, let us turn back to Narnia. As we wrap up our first lecture, I'd like to take you back to the beginning, to the creation of Narnia, to a time of deeper magic. Next time, we will look more deeply at Narnia as we focus on the lion and the witch. The reading comes from the first book in the series, The Magician's Nephew. In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath them. Its lower notes were deep enough to be the voice of the earth herself. There were no words, There was hardly even a tune. Then two wonders happened at the same moment. One was that the voice was suddenly joined by other voices, more voices than you could possibly count. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up the scale, cold, tingling, silvery voices. The second wonder was that the blackness overhead all at once was blazing with stars. They didn't come out gently one by one as they do on a summer evening. One moment there had been nothing but darkness, next moment 1,000 points of light leaped out. Single stars, constellations, and planets, brighter and bigger than any in our world. There were no clouds. The new stars and the new voices began at exactly the same time. It was the first voice, the deep one, which had made them appear and made them sing. Thank you.